Good evening and a very warm welcome to everyone who's joined us today. We are assembled this evening for the release of our recent publication, Shakespeare's Revisions of History, Social Collusion, Violence and Resistance in 9 Plays by Professor Ruth Vanita. On behalf of Primus Books and our holding company Ratna Sagar, I'd like to thank you all for participating in this event. On this occasion, we'd like to welcome Professor R.W. Desai, the chair for the session, the panelists, Professor Sharmishta Panja and Professor Poonam Trivedi. We also have with us Dr. Yogesh Dubey, President of the Shakespeare Society of India. In Shakespeare's Revisions of History, Professor Vanita provides close readings of widely studied Shakespeare plays and puts forward some groundbreaking arguments with an emphasis on how violence is made possible by social collusion, both deliberate and inadvertent. By closely examining the roles played by bystanders and how their omissions and actions allow vulnerable individuals, such as women, Jews, and the elderly, to be oppressed, Professor Vanita's perspective sheds new light on the playwright's understanding of society and the systemic violence that is often embedded in social structures. What is especially intriguing in the second part of the argument is the idea that in his later plays, Shakespeare didn't just accept these power structures, rather, he explored the possibility of reconciliation and redemption by shifting focus to the potential for collective action and the power of the powerless, centered around the possibility of forgiveness and the potential for a more inclusive society. Now, before we proceed to the main event, and in anticipation of a rich discussion, allow me to introduce our author, this evening's chair, and the panelists. Ruth Vanita is Professor Emerita, University of Montana, and has previously taught at English Department Miranda House and later at the Department of English, University of Delhi. Professor Vanita has authored several books, most recently The Broken Rainbow, Poems and Translations, 2 novels, Memory of Light and a Slight Angle, The Dharma of Justice in the Sanskrit Epics, Debates on Gender, Varna and Species, Love's Right, Same-Sex Marriages in Modern India, and has published over 80 scholarly articles. Additionally, she has translated several works from Hindi to English, including Mahadevi Varma's My Family and Memory of Light as Pariyon Ke Beech. She co-edited the path-breaking Same-Sex Love in India and edited and translated On the Edge, 100 Years of Hindi Fiction on Same-Sex Desire. We also have 3 eminent scholars with us this evening for the book release and discussion. Firstly, I'd like to welcome the chair for the session this evening. Professor R.W. Desai has rightly been called India's greatest living Shakespeare scholar. He taught at Hindu College and thereafter was a professor in the English department, Delhi University. He founded and edited the journal Hamlet Studies in 1979 to 2003. It was the only international journal on a single Shakespeare play. He has authored several books, including Yeats's Shakespeare, Sir John Falstaff Knight, and Shakespearean Latencies. He is the editor of several books and has authored many articles, and is also the director of filmed extracts from Hamlet and from Dr. Faustus, both with all Indian casts. On the panel, we are delighted to have with us Professor Sharmishta Panja and Professor Poonam Trivedi. Professor Panja was professor in the English department, Delhi University, and has also previously taught at Stanford University and IIT Delhi. She is the author of Sidney Spencer and the Royal Reader, the editor of many volumes, including 3 on Shakespeare, and the author of several articles. She has held fellowships at the Huntington Library and the Folger Shakespeare Library. She was president of the Shakespeare Society of India from 2008 to 2014. Our next speaker, Professor Poonam Trivedi, taught English at Indraprastha College. Delhi University. She is an expert on Shakespeare in India and has co-edited 4 volumes in this field. One of them is titled Asian Interventions in Global Shakespeare, and 2 volumes on other topics. She has published several articles on Shakespeare in Asia. She is the vice chair of the Asian Shakespeare Association and has served as secretary to the Shakespeare Society of India. We are also very thankful to Dr. Yogesh Dubey for agreeing to moderate the Q&A session for us. Dr. Dubey is Associate Professor at the English Department, Delhi University. He is currently President of the Shakespeare Society of India. Now, before we begin with the event, I'd like to invite Mr. B.N. Verma to address the audience. Because of his poor eyesight, I think his wife, Professor Pramodni Verma, will briefly address the audience.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am delighted to see the stalwarts of Shakespeare studies in India gathered together on stage here. Amrapali has already told you about the stellar work they have done, so I am not going to repeat it. But seeing so many scholars from Delhi University here, I am reminded of my own time at the university. I remember vividly the day, sometime in July-August 1969, when the newly appointed Vice-Chancellor of Delhi University, Professor Sarup Singh, who till then had been heading the Department of English, announced to us, wide-eyed students who had just joined the MA English class, that he had got for us a tall, dark and handsome professor to teach us Shakespeare. He was referring, of course, to Professor Rupen Desai. And not just him, there was a whole new set of faculty members from British, American and Indian universities to teach us. Delhi University that year had just started with the semester system, and we were going to be the guinea pigs. But we were also privileged to have scholars from Yale, Northwestern, Cambridge, Oxford, Warwick, Delhi to teach us and make something worthwhile out of us. And I would like to take this opportunity to express my gratitude and indebtedness to those who taught me, Professors G.K. Das, Vinod Sena, Rupen Desai, Yudhishthir Sahab, Nalini Jain, Brijraj Singh, Somraj Gupta, and later on my friends and advisors like Rajiv Verma, Manju Jain, Harish Trivedi, Shormishtha Panja and Sambudha Sen, all of whom went on to shape me and my professional career as a publisher. I am honored that I have had the opportunity to publish many of the names I have mentioned, and I hope that Primus will continue to go on to publish many more. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Verma. Thank you, Mr. Verma, for sharing your experience with us. I now request Professor Desai to formally release the book and hold it up for the audience. I'd also request other panelists to kindly join in.
Thank you. I will hold up the book, which of course everyone has already seen. But before I do that, I will mention, no, just a moment. Before I do that, Professor Ruth Vanita's magnum opus was this book, Sappho and the Virgin Mary, published in 1996. And the full title is Same-Sex Love and the English Literary Imagination. So this is the first book which I think received international recognition. Now, I will, do I open it?
Yes, that's all. Just hold it.
Shakespeare's Revisions of History.
Thank you very much, professors, for releasing the book and for your interest in this book and also for participating in this discussion. Quickly, after the chair and the panelists have all said a few words, we'll have a short Q&A session. So if anyone has any question for the author or the panelists, please feel free to ask. I will now request Professor Desai to share his comments as the chair for the session.
Now, this is a publication that specializes in the field of love between women as well as between men. And Ruth, I'll now refer to her not as Professor Ruth Vanita, but as Ruth. Ruth shows that lesbian connections are not exclusively the province of women writers, as we may assume, like Virginia Woolf, for example, but that male writers, Shelley and Keats, for example, and of course D.H. Lawrence's Women and Love, celebrated the relationship with equal ardor, and this quite apart from homosexual connections as in Oscar Wilde and E.M. Forster. So the field is wide and expansive. However, since the thrust of this event is Ruth's Shakespearean critical writing, I will restrict myself to 3 plays: As You Like It, Othello, and The Winter's Tale, all of which are, of course, in this book too. But I wrote my response to Ruth's Shakespeare criticism before this book was published. That's why, but the ground covered is the same. So I've said all 3 also in Shakespeare's Revisions of History, published by Bola Verma. Adopting an approach to As You Like It that provokes the reader. I particularly emphasize the word provokes. She is a provocative girl, and therefore everyone must beware. That provokes the reader rather than merely providing information. She finds in this play many details that support her argument. The bonding between Rosalind and Celia, despite the wrath of Celia's father. The fictitious identity as a man with the name Ganymede that Rosalind takes, which Ruth seems to suggest is something of a joke. And I think all of us will agree that it is something of a joke. Felt by Orlando as well, hanging his doggerel verses on trees. Thus, writing from the lesbian perspective, Ruth makes a strong case in favor, and I'm quoting now, of the Celia-Rosalind attachment being initially described as more than sisterly, indeed unprecedented, with an emphasis on Celia's love for Rosalind, unquote, while at the same time minimizing the Rosalind, Ganymede, Orlando intensely romantic relationship, which is, for many readers, the heart and soul of the play. I, as director of this play, performed by the Globe Society of Hindu College, Delhi, in 1957, was aware that several of the actors thought it incredible that Orlando failed to recognize Rosalind. And of course, that seems incredible. And indeed, they had a point. At play's end, when questioned by Duke Senior, he admits, "My lord, the first time that I ever saw him, methought he was a brother to your daughter, coming close to recognition. But as I remarked a few minutes ago, Ruth provokes the reader more than she persuades. And therein lies the strength of her papers. The reader is challenged on every page by the footnotes as well, 20 in all. As editor of Hamlet Studies, I asked Professor Schoenbaum, a member of the advisory board, author of Shakespeare, A Documentary Life. I think Ruth has referred to this book, to offer his opinion on an essay submitted for our consideration. His reply, "I've seen friskier rabbits before. We don't want to put our readers to sleep. I have no hesitation in reporting to this knowledgeable audience that all three essays by Ruth are friskier rabbits and would have met Professor Schoenbaum's expectations had he been still alive." Turning then to Othello, the subtitle of her paper is "The Unprotectedness of Wives in Othello." And we learn at the outset that her argument is that Desdemona and Emilia die similar deaths for similar reasons. In each case, the death blow is struck by one particular individual, but it is made possible by the collusion of a number of others who act on the assumption that husband-wife relations are governed by norms quite different from those that govern other human relations. Ruth's paper makes painful reading because it exposes with admirable scholarship and irrefutable ratiocination the helplessness of wives at the hands of their husbands. But as she points out, I quote from Ruth, "It is made possible by the collusion of a number of others who fail to act on the assumption that husband-wife relations are governed by norms different from those that govern other human relations." Certainly, her argument is irrefutable, and especially so because advanced by the co-editor from 1979 to 1990 of Manushi, which all of us are familiar with, a journal defending the rights of women. However, though it can be argued that human rights are timeless, it seems to me that some allowance must be made for their infringement. When looking back in history at a period over 400 years ago, long before DNA testing to determine parenthood came into existence. Let's all keep this in mind. A somewhat similar erasure of the time gap between the now and the then can be seen in the fully justified power and passion of Ruth's indignation against the prevailing now. But what was the zeitgeist then? Further, and now I come to a tricky point, isn't Desdemona unnecessarily denying that she had lost her handkerchief? Had she spoken the truth, Othello might have been appeased. He asked her, "Is it lost?" She said, "No." Next, isn't Desdemona indiscreet in her insistence that Cassio be restored to lieutenancy, despite having been drunk while on military duty. Despite being drunk while on military duty. A serious offense? Shakespeare invariably gives us a bipolar view of any action. I come now to the third play, The Winter's Tale. Ruth has an excellent argument that with the banishing of Hermione and Paulina for 16 years, we have a case of feminine bonding, despite all of the male courtiers being helpless spectators of Leontes' unbridled and irrational fury. But then there is always a but. And that but is what I would like now to present to this knowledgeable and astute audience. But since Shakespeare invariably gives us a bipolar view of any action, is this fully applicable to Leontes as well? I will answer the question point-wise. First, isn't it astonishing that Polixenes has stayed away from his country, wife and son, for 9 months? 9 months. And he said himself, Polixenes has said himself, if at home, sir, he, that is my son, is all my exercise, all my mirth. 9 months. What's the significance of this number? We all know the answer. And Hermione gives us the answer with the birth of Perdita. Exactly 9 months, and Perdita is born. Fourth, Hermione's familiarity with Polixenes is being watched by Leontes. Too hot. To mingle friendship far is mingling bloods. In other words, we are also members of the audience watching this. Is a running commentary on the action by Leontes, which we too are monitoring. The most significant change that Shakespeare made, and Ruth mentions this, from Green's Pandosto, that was the source of this Winter's Tale, was to invert the country's origin of Leontes from Bohemia in the north, which is liberal, to Sicilia in the south, which was highly conservative. This is an important cultural aspect of the play, since both Polixenes and Hermione are from the north and exercise a degree of familiarity with each other, but galling to Leontes. This is an important point, but I won't stress it because I know everyone is familiar. The question of paternity is fraught with uncertainty. This, of course, makes all the men in this audience nervous. Consider the following fascinating excerpt from Harris Wilson's King James VI and the First, 1956. This is again a little scene that all of us are familiar with. About 2 p.m, Lord Darnley, Mary's husband, that is Queen Elizabeth's cousin, Mary, came to her apartment and asked to see the child. My lord, said Mary, God has given you and me a son, begotten by none but you. Darnley blushed and kissed the infant. The Queen took the child in her arms, drew back the coverlet to show its face, and said once more, My lord, Here I protest to God, as I shall answer to him at the great day of judgment. This is your son, and no other man's son. The witty Mama's baby, Papa's maybe is confirmed by Joyce's Stephen when he muses, fatherhood in the sense of conscious begetting is unknown to man. To man, upon uncertitude, upon unlikelihood, paternity may be a legal fiction. Who is the father of any son that any son should love him or he any son? I'll conclude with congratulations to Ruth for provoking us as well as enlightening us in an area of scholarship as well as of human experience. Now, Ruth, do I introduce Professor Panja?
No, she's
No.
already been introduced.
I stop
Yeah,
here.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Desai, for your very insightful observations, which have shed much light on the book and particularly about the 3 plays that you discussed. I'm very sure this was enlightening for the audience. I would now like to request Professor Panja to share her views on the book.
Thank you. This book has 7 chapters and it discusses 9 plays, including Hamlet, Othello, King Lear, As You Like It, Merchant of Venice, Measure for Measure, and The Winter's Tale. Some of the chapters are based on 6 previously published articles by Ruth in the past 20 years, such as the one on Celia and Rosalind's relationship that Professor Desai referred to, which I had also included in my book, Critical Theory Textual Application, and essays published in journals like Shakespeare Survey, SEL, Comparative Drama, etc. But they have all been revised and updated. Now, I think the first thing that struck me was that Ruth refuses to be sucked into the cauldron of critical theory and sticks to what she does best, which is close readings of the text. As a result, her arguments are persuasive and present as textual evidence lines that one may have overlooked or not seen as significant earlier. For example, Lodovico and Gratiano's refusal to inform Desdemona about her father's death in Othello, or Desdemona's puzzling comment about Lodovico being a fine man, puzzling because it is spoken to Emilia when Desdemona is under tremendous stress because of Othello's abusive behavior. Ruth reads the line as an ironic comment on Lodovico and Gratiano not coming to her aid. Despite this aversion to critical theory, I would say that Ruth is to a certain extent influenced by new historicists like Stephen Greenblatt. She cites him a number of times. She also disagrees with his reading of Hamlet in Purgatory, who use evidence from non-literary medieval and early modern texts to support their reading of a Shakespeare play. For example, Ruth presents a wealth of evidence about accounts of the physical torture of saints, and there are some really gory passages in this book, when she talks about Isabella's choice of chastity in order to save her soul over the support of her brother in Measure for Measure, or how the sight of Shylock sharpening his knife in anticipation of extracting a pound of flesh would not necessarily have appeared shocking and nauseating to an early modern audience that had witnessed the chopping off of John Stubbs's right hand publicly for the writing of a gaping gulf against Queen Elizabeth's proposed marriage to the Roman Catholic Duke d'Alençon, or sundry other people being flogged and mutilated in public, even for petty crimes. One of the strains that runs through Ruth's essays is religion, as in the discussion of Roman Catholicism versus Protestantism in her reading of Hamlet, where she makes the extremely novel observation that one should not assume that just because Hamlet studied in Wittenberg, he had Protestant leanings, as, and I quote, Wittenberg was founded as a Catholic institution in 1502, and Martin Luther was a Catholic priest who received his degree in theology there. This is page 75 of Ruth's book, before becoming the pioneer of what would later be called Protestantism. Or that Hamlet's readiness is all echoes Thomas à Kempis's Imitation of Christ, written between 1390 and 1440, a medieval Latin text, and she quotes from Thomas à Kempis, "If you be not ready today," and we can immediately hear the echo in Hamlet, "how shalt thou be ready tomorrow? Be ever ready to face death," is what he means. The lives of many saints are seen as models for female behavior, which might otherwise appear outrageous. So what she's saying is that these characters appear incomprehensible on the social plane because, the voices that they are listening to belong to a different order of being, not to the material world. For example, the Saint Perpetua, who even while being a daughter, a wife, and a mother, chose martyrdom over her family. She is compared by Ruth to Isabella, choosing to save her soul rather than her brother's life in Measure for Measure. Ruth cites a 15th century account of saints' lives by the Voragine, translated into English by William Caxton, and Luke 14.26 in this connection. I quote from Luke. "If any man come to me and hate not his father and mother and wife and children and sisters, yea, and his own life also, he cannot be my disciple." On the same note, Ruth allies many of the plays with scriptures about the Virgin Mary, which I see as a connection to her 1996 book, Sappho and the Virgin Mary, Same-Sex Love in the English Literary Imagination, that Professor Desai referred to. The last chapter of Ruth's book analyzes the ways in which Marian imagery is used in Henry VIII and Winter's Tale, and I quote, "to celebrate female autonomy and alliances and present a woman more worth than any man." Ruth argues that Hermione's position is similar to medieval plays about the Virgin Mary as a pregnant woman who is put on trial, while Catherine of Aragon, the Roman Catholic first wife of Henry VIII, is unqueened in the play Henry VIII, just as the Virgin Mary was unqueened during the Reformation. I have a few sort of disagreements with Ruth, and I'll just briefly go into some of these. One of them is her reading of the Hamlet-Ophelia relationship as a youthful but superficial love for a woman who is no match for him. And I think if we look at Ophelia's speeches in her mad scene, there is a kind of intellectual density there which may not always be evident in her somewhat laconic responses to her father, brother, and even to Hamlet. So, I'm not sure that I agree with Ruth there. And the readings of Bassanio's comparative lack of anti-Semitism in an otherwise egregiously anti-Semitic play, The Merchant of Venice, or Portia's Machiavellian maneuvering may be, I think, just a little overdone. I mean, I see Bassanio's carelessness about others' fortunes and feelings as not I don't see him as being anti-Semitic because I just think that he's not abusive to Shylock as much as the others because basically he's living in his own little bubble. He's barely aware of Shylock. As Ruth herself says, he has difficulty understanding what Shylock experiences. So I don't think we should see this as any example of nobility or magnanimity in Bassanio. And I also think that one can argue in a reading, as Ruth does, that persuasively argues the woman's part, why the intelligence and yes, even the ruthlessness of a Portia can be seen as a reaction to the many constraints to which a patriarchal society subjects her. Ruth's reading of Edgar, too, I have disagreements with. She explains Edgar describing the fiend, as he calls it, who accompanied Gloucester. Of course, he's fibbing to Gloucester. It was Edgar himself who accompanied Gloucester on the cliffs. Ruth explains that by saying Edgar is revulsed by houseless people like Tom. He says it was some fiend because Edgar views people like poor Tom, bedlam beggars, the absolute lowest dregs of society. He views them as things. Now, I think there is a very clear parallel in this most moving of Shakespeare's plays between the trajectory of King Lear and Edgar. Both of them have to learn the very hard way how to empathize with people. That's why there are verbal parallels in how they present themselves at the end of the play. Edgar says, Lear says, I'm a very foolish, fond old man, 80 and upward, not an hour more nor less, and to deal plainly, I fear I'm not in my perfect mind. Act 4, scene 7, line 60 onwards, which is exactly accurate. Okay, there's none of this, know you not who I am, my daughters, my trains, my 100 knights, I'm the king, etc. None of that. What is he? He's just a very foolish, fond old man, 80 and upward, not an hour more or less, and to deal plainly, I fear I'm not in my perfect mind. Just a few lines earlier, Edgar had said to Gloucester that he is a most poor man, made tame to fortune's blows, who by the art of known and feeling sorrows am pregnant to good pity. Look at how all the images of childbirth and of the woman resurge and come back in these lines. You know, images that Lear had cut himself off from when he had said, touch me with noble anger and let not women's weapons, water drops, stain my man's cheeks. The re-entrance of empathy, the relearning of how to be compassionate and to feel for others is something that both Edgar and Lear go through. That's why Edgar's lines at the end are so laconic. You know, there's just, he says we must speak what we feel, not what we ought to say. There's a wealth of wisdom in those lines, you know, that can be unpacked. So I don't think that this is a character who can look down on creatures like poor Tom. Okay. So there are no titles, riches, family members that either of these two men refer to when they talk about themselves. And this difficultly earned knowledge is, I think, the stuff of the play. A tendency to pinpoint characters' failings with a chilling accuracy should not undercut Ruth's call to empathy, which is everywhere evident in her readings, and to a new vision of the future, as in her reading of the figure of Perdita, who she says is both a throwback to Mary and an altogether new kind of being, one who brings with her alternate family arrangements and cross-class allegiances, something that we've seen with, Lear calling poor Tom his philosopher, his Athenian philosopher, right? The cross-class allegiances. He doesn't know that this is Gloucester's son. Rather than embrace any ideology, and this is something that Ruth says she would rather not do, Shakespeare's plays explore and ultimately end in what another poet has called the foul rag and bone shop of the heart. And this is something that Ruth reminds us of. We turn our eyes away from the deprived, the old, the impecunious, the powerless, and the infirm, only at our peril. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Panja, for your very scholarly insights on the book that sort of added to the ongoing discussion. So thank you very much. I would now request Professor Poonam Trivedi to share her observations on the book.
Thank you. I'd like to make some, sorry, general comments, first. This book, Shakespeare's revisions of history, social collusion, violence, and resistance in 9 plays. The title, of course, is very elusive. I'll come to that. Very elusive in the sense, refers to so many things. I'll come to that in a minute. But I'd like to say this is very unusual now to have a monograph on Shakespeare published here in India today. Shakespeare is receding from our syllabus and from specializations of teachers, and from serious critical comments is very rare, and especially in mainstream kind of readings and commentary. We have had several collections of essays published over last decades, etc. Many of them, I myself have edited quite a few, but they have a different impact. Each essay is different, even though there is an overarching theme, and collectively they say many things. But to have a monograph is another thing, and it shows how a certain kind of a mind and a certain kind of scholarship and the depth of that is revealed in a monograph. And this is to be applauded, definitely. Ruth has published many essays earlier. Many of these chapters are reworkings of essays that some of us had read earlier and were quite impressed with, but all being put together in a book is definitely something to be congratulated for. And women's histories, here, the title is very, very intriguing. Shakespeare's revisions of history. Ruth specifies very much in the very first line that these are not sort of dry, detailed pages full of historical dates and figures. Many books we have had in which, the reader has to plod through all that, which you may enjoy or not. But here she says these are sort of, personal histories, as she finds, of characters in the plays and how they refer back to the life of the times, etc. in Shakespeare, and then how they may make meaning for us today. And therefore, women's histories, revisions, in the sense that I got, is that there were conditions there, and his plays, in a way, make you see women's positions and their histories, as it were, all afresh. He critiques a lot of the context in which they are placed, and of course in plays and the patriarchy which comes with them. And of course we expect no less from an author like Ruth, because she has been a pioneer of women's writing and criticism of women's issues by starting the very first, I think it was the very first journal devoted to women, Manushi, and she was, co-editor of that for how many? I think 10, 15 years?
30.
Well, okay, yeah. So, it's a trajectory that we have to be very grateful for and very happy about. She has not given up her first passion, as it were, and has only added to it and refined it in a very, very scholarly manner. Ruth has, of course, been extremely prodigious in writing and very productive I don't think you read out her whole list of publications. This is very long. And most of them do reflect on women's issues. The latest one, no less, of course, may be the best. Here, people will have different views. But I'm saying maybe the best because I haven't read all her writings. So, but I have read this one fairly carefully. And the book here is full of, I think, great and small insights. As Professor Desai said in the beginning, and many of these insights are very provocative and shift our earlier conceptions, if not fully, but they force us to rethink many of our views on many, of course, all characters are well known. For example, Bassanio. Sharmishta has talked about Bassanio. I always thought Bassanio was a bit of a wimp. But Ruth has, gone through the play very, very carefully and given you, textual and evidence that he is a good man in a way. And, as she says, good, but perhaps lesser. He is not strong. He does not protest. And this thing, and he goes along with Antonio and all the anti-Semitism around him, etc. But he's there. And of course, Isabella. And she says, her phrase at the end of Measure for Measure, and Isabella's dilemma is Isabella is kind of shut in a trapdoor. And I thought that was brilliant. Because there is this great dilemma before Isabella to whether if she would accept the Duke, then she is repudiating all that she stood for and all that she has argued for and that she has been working towards to become. She's already a novice and to become a regular member of the St. Clair's order. Or, in a trapdoor, but if she also refuses, as some, other people have said this, though Ruth does not directly say this, that she, to have her go back to the nunnery also, other critics have said, would not have perhaps gone down so well in the post-Reformation England. So we have to see how Shakespeare is dealing and how he is writing, and especially so many endings are full of all these ambiguities. Sometimes you feel that Shakespeare wants to have it both ways. Maybe for commercial reasons. After all, this was his livelihood, and this was the entertainment industry. Or maybe because he plays, ambiguities are, in a way, the crux of so many Shakespearean characters. And they leave us guessing which way, and we leave us arguing, either pro or con in every play. So there is I'll come back to Isabella in a minute. What you notice about this book, and it strikes you immediately, is the great intimacy of the author with the Shakespearean canon. There are cross-references and intertextualities with other plays, poems, sonnets, which come up all the time. And they enrich, the comments made on particular character, particular play, by its kind of referencing and comparison with other works of Shakespeare. And of course, even broader intertextuality there is with other plays of the period, other sort of, dramatists where this is relevant come in. So, on the other hand, there is no attempt to, sometimes, historicism, etc., you have a little suspicion that, writers are trying to show off some other kinds of knowledges that ordinary readers don't have. I'm afraid you don't get that at all with this book. There is close reading, very close reading of the text, particularly over the tricky debated bits, which he goes over, the lines very, very carefully, minutely, looking at their meanings in several different contexts and what would be applied and how we have. And especially there's paying very close attention to the shorter sentences and phrases, that the characters have in their speeches, which sometimes usually get elided over when we are reading, because there are so many sort of, great speeches in all the plays. You concentrate on those, and that, by the time you've woven through all of them, that's enough. So, in that way, the writing of the book is quite exemplary in so many ways. And of course, it's immensely readable. There is no sort of heavy jargon which has plagued Shakespeare studies for a long time, and also made the teaching of it very difficult for us teachers. And especially, I taught in an undergraduate college, and to get all that across to young kids who are perhaps reading Shakespeare for the first time was quite a challenge. You had to kind of water it all down to get it across. And then you wondered, what am I doing and how is it going? So you don't have any trouble with that in this book. This is, on the other hand, it gives you lots of very unusual and happy things, great creativity. I'd like to just make a few more remarks in the time that I have on the play Measure for Measure, which is really my favorite play. And I've written on it to myself. And I was pleased to find that Ruth's readings have extended many of my own readings of this play, especially of Isabella. That, I did think that it is a very Catholic play, and that Isabella is in the process of being a nun. In fact, she's on the eve of taking her vows when she's called into the real world, as it were, and to deal with, law and corruption and etc. So it's there, and Ruth talks a lot about, delves into the issue of Isabella insisting on preserving her chastity. Now that's been an issue that has divided critics over the centuries, but Ruth again, in a way, her reading confirms Isabella's convictions very well. That for her, it to give in to Angelo, even for the sake of her brother, would be like giving in to damnation. It's, as she says, not just a tainting of the body, but also a tainting of the mind. This is there. And very interestingly, in this chapter, she compares Hamlet and Isabella, a very unusual comparison. I have not come across that before. Maybe there is. It's impossible to say, in a way that's not done before in Shakespeare studies, because there are hundreds of essays coming out all the time. But I found that quite very interesting, that, putting the two together, though they are very different in almost every way, but of course, Shormishta just mentioned a very new fact that about Wittenberg, that, it was also a Catholic monastery, etc., and they teach, and so makes you rethink that it's always been seen as a very kind of Protestant kind of play. And but that she says that these two are connected because they have to face dilemmas which are not of their own making. And even the sort of the villainous characters are also named sort of similarly, Claudius and Claudio. So there are many subtle, let's say, overlaps and echoes in the two things, and all sort of much detail there is. And she has a section on sisters and brothers also, which I found very interesting in this essay, that where Isabella is not just sister of the St. Clare's convent, but she is also sister to Claudio, who is being sort of, in a way, abandoning her to a fate which will be almost worse than his own, because he stands to be executed according to the law, but Isabella stands to be damned if she gives in to. So these kinds of equations, which some may think, when you think brothers and sisters, all this is very pedestrian, might seem pedestrian, but it's not. In this way, looking at relationships very closely, again, shows you another side of the play that has been not suspected before. I like the word collusion, social collusion in the subtitle. Again, I don't think it's been used in any other book or in any kind of a serious and detailed fashion. Has this idea being pointed out that they're not just villains, who out of their own sort of wishes or characters do wrong in the plays, but that they are in a way supported by society and the social thinking of that time and period. So this kind of social collusion is an important aspect that she highlights. We just take it for granted. We just say patriarchy, okay. And but let's fine-tune that, and that's what she's done. And I think, of course, she shows that, of course, it's most evident in The Merchant of Venice, where there is all this sort of great, judophobia, as she calls it, in the play, and verses, and Shylock is trying different ways to combat that and to make them see his position. And of course it also occurs in Othello, and very cutely she points out that how in the last scene and in the death scene, how the others are just standing by and they don't make any attempt to disarm Iago. Number of lines go by and he has the space to go and stab Emilia also. And somehow when we're reading it, we just glide over these bits. And it's like, you see, she makes this fine argument that the death of a woman and the death of the wife, and if the husband is accusing her of lying, that's not quite so heinous. as you know, when Othello is trying to stab Iago, but he runs away. So there are all these very fine tuned arguments which are night and in the play. I was also very pleased to find that she has extended, this idea of the Marian devotion, because I have written on that and on virginity tracts and, the whole discourse, virginity tracts, that was quite prevalent, of course, in medieval England. And then later on, even after the Reformation, as we all know, that the Reformation was not such a watertight divide. And people didn't just change beliefs overnight. Lots of the beliefs kept on going, and Marian devotion and the heritage of she has mined very successfully, and there's an area that has been, I think, not so well worked on and not given enough attention to. For example, in Stratford-on-Avon, there is an important church, I forget its name, which is just across the road from, the big house that Shakespeare owned, etc. And today people, if you go there, people show you how the walls of that church, the frescoes on the walls of that church were just hastily whitewashed over during the Reformation. And over the years, the frescoes are re-emerging. You can see the, paintings at the back, which are of Catholic saints, their martyrdoms, etc. So the book and the writing is sensitive to these issues, etc. Another bit that is very interesting, I know that Ruth's essay on Taming of the Shrew is circulated a lot, and the ending, which is again a point of controversy, says that Ruth says, either people say that, she's completely succumbing, this is under the thumb of Petruchio, or she's being very ironic, etc. But she says no, she is being submissive because she knows that she has no other option, that women were helpless. Their only life was either being looked after by the father or the husband. So she submits out of a kind of helplessness. I'd like to perhaps bring in here, Taming of the Shrew was performed by a Pakistani group for the Globe to Globe Theatre Olympiad in 2012. And they played the ending very cleverly and playfully, in which they showed that Kate is in fact not just colluding with Petruchio and making him, my lord and master, etc. But through their play acting and the movement on the stage and the blocking and a kind of winking and nudging that went on, that they are also play acting to themselves and scoring points over each other in that thing. And it was extremely successful. Reviews of this play can be read, there are many things. So, these ambiguous endings continue to give a thought for all of us. About Isabella, there's just, I just had one or two kind of little, one can't expect one book to write about all the plays and write about everything in one play. Ruth makes a statement that Hamlet is abandoned by his mother. Now, I quite disagree with that, if I may. I think Gertrude is a much misunderstood woman, and if she hastily marries Claudio, Shakespeare gives her very few lines. For such an important character in the play, he gives her few lines, and she maybe have been pressurized or by Claudius. And you never know. I mean, Claudius would marry again and then produce an heir which will undermine totally Hamlet's own position. So it may be seen as an act of, as it were, support for Hamlet and consolidation of his right to the throne of Denmark. So there are many issues here. I think I have about Isabella, just one other point, that Ruth pays such close attention to the words, the language, imagery of the plays, and particularly this. I wish she'd said something more about Angelo's statement when Isabella leaves after the first meeting. He says, "She speaks, and 'tis such sense that my sense breeds with it." So congratulations, Ruth. I think there's lots to think about and talk about your book. And thank you for calling me to speak on it. I'm sorry, in my rambly way. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Professor Trivedi, for sharing your valuable thoughts on the book. I would now request Professor Vanita to talk about her book.
I'd like to begin by thanking Primus Books for the wonderful job they've done from the inception and through the editing, production, and cover designing process all the way to this launch. First, thanks to Bhola Verma, for he immediately accepted my proposal and has been helpful and supportive. Second, thanks to my exemplary editor, Amrapali Sharma. She didn't introduce herself, but that's the MC, who was meticulous and patient throughout and caught several typos. I've worked with many publishers, and I know that a good editor is both rare and invaluable. And third, thanks to Prasoon, Abhijit, and the rest of the team who have helped with planning, marketing, and with this event. In a way, this book has been in the making all of my adult life. Therefore, I owe a debt to everyone who helped me get here, from my first teacher, who was my mother, to my teachers at Miranda House and the English department, especially Professor Desai, who not only taught me Shakespeare and Yeats at the MA level, but with whom I have had many conversations about Shakespeare over the years. Whatever I was working on, whether it was Wolf for my dissertation supervised by Professor Harish Trivedi, or my other non-fiction, fiction, and poetry, Shakespeare has always been a presiding presence for me. And so this book, any book is a conversation with the living and with the dead. And I'm thankful to all my colleagues with whom I've had these conversations, both in Delhi and in Montana, Shakespeareans like Poonam and Sharmishta, and also many others. Many thanks to Professor Desai, Sharmishta, Poonam, and Yogesh for taking the time to read the book at very short notice. And I'm very grateful for all the kind things that they have said. Yogesh said some things to me on email. Thanks to my family who couldn't be here, my wife Mona Bachman, who never fails to wish me on Shakespeare's birthday, and my son Arjun, who has had to put up with my annoying recitations of Shakespeare in and out of season. He's now learned some lines without intending to do so. Thank you, Jyoti, for your encouragement. And finally, many thanks to all of you for coming here. I know it's no easy feat to cross Delhi on a weekday. A little bit just about my journey with this book. When the announcement for the book went out, Tapan Basu wrote to me to say that he's happy that I've returned to Shakespeare. I've often felt that in a different society, perhaps another lifetime, I would have stayed with Shakespeare and Keats. Coming back to Shakespeare, though, after many forays elsewhere, it's like coming home. I feel that I never left Shakespeare, or rather that Shakespeare never left me. And this is because, I think, partly at least, because in Shakespeare there is a line for every emotion, experience, state of mind, and stage in life. And these lines keep coming to one's mind. Now, of course, we can quote many lines and we can think of all the famous ones about anger and jealousy and fear and love. But it's true even of the commonplace things. For example, driving from Gurgaon to Delhi for lunch and then driving back to Gurgaon for dinner, I often think of Petruccio's line from The Taming of the Shrew: "Nothing but sit and eat and eat." I don't remember when I first encountered Shakespeare, because when I was a child, my mother recited sonnets and passages from the plays aloud as she went about the house, along with poems by others like Keats and Shelley, Coleridge, Tennyson. So I imbibed these poems by osmosis, and I got to know the poems by heart. Knowing a poem by heart is somewhat different from memorizing it. If the poem is in your heart, it comes to you when you need it. I'm so glad to be launching this book in Delhi, because this is where my engagement with Shakespeare began. My first ever formal presentation was a paper on King Lear at an international conference at Delhi University. And my first 3 essays, which everyone's talked about, in which Professor Desai talked about, these were my first 3 essays in academic journals. They were on Shakespeare, and they were published while I was teaching here at Delhi University. I realized later that if you publish an article in an Indian journal, Western scholars either never see it or they don't think they need to cite it. In 1990, my first academic article was published in Delhi University English Department's journal, Yearly Review. That was the article in As You Like It. And it made a new argument that had never before been made. Several years later, in the late 90s and 2000s, several Western scholars made the same argument, exactly the same argument, without acknowledging my essay. But when I published the essays on Othello and The Winter's Tale in US and UK journals, then they were cited by most scholars, not by all, who made a similar argument later. Shakespeare's plays also shaped my consciousness when I taught them in a variety of BA and MA classes, first at Miranda House, then at English Department here, and then in Montana. When teaching Othello to BA Pass students, I translated the entire play extempore into Hindi, and my ideas about the play germinated in that class. Similarly, my understanding of As You Like It blossomed in a very lively English honors class. And I came to understand the dynamics of The Taming of the Shrew when I co-directed a student production of that play at Miranda House. So I'm also grateful to the many students who participated in discussions that generated some of my ideas. So just a couple of things about my vision of Shakespeare, and that reflected in the book, I think. One of the features that interests me most is the way that Shakespeare reconfigures the same basic plot in play after play, removing or adding an element to create a different dynamic. For example, in his recurrent jealous husband plot, he finally removes the villain in The Winter's Tale, thus eliminating any excuse for the husband. So Iago can be blamed, of course he's to blame, but he draws out the doubts that are already in Othello's heart. But Leontes in Winter's Tale doesn't need any Iago to construct what he thinks is evidence. Children are another element added in The Winter's Tale. None of the earlier wives who are accused of having affairs have children. One effect of this is that unlike Desdemona, who remains attached to Othello until the end, even when he's murdering her, Hermione is more attached to her daughter. She says so. She has come back to life. She has kept herself alive to meet her daughter. Likewise, in plots about an isolated individual who is betrayed and hounded by society, so these individuals do have some support. Isabella has the fake support of the Duke. Shylock has limited support from Tubal. Hamlet has genuine support, but only from Horatio. And Timon only from Flavius. But this changes in King Lear, where Lear and Cordelia receive widespread sympathy from a range of characters who are not connected to each other, cross-class, cross-gender. This may make no difference to the outcome. The outcome is still tragic. But it does temper, it gives some consolation to the viewer that other people in the play, they see the truth. And so that's an added element. So these are some of the patterns that I explore when studying how Shakespeare depicts social collusion against or for an isolated individual like Hamlet, Lear, Isabella, or a whole group such as women or Jews or old people or the poor. And then what Poonam mentioned, another pattern that interests me is a broader one, which occurs across European society and across time. And this is the way that Europeans developed the goddess-like figures of Mary and the female saints, drawing upon the European pre-Christian goddesses that Christianity had erased. And several historians have talked about that, how Athena and goddesses like that come back in the form of the Virgin Mary. These figures dominated medieval art and literature. If you walk through any great museum in the West, you can see this. The entire medieval section is full of these female figures, saint after saint, some of whom we have never heard of, but Mary and her mother, Saint Anne, and her grandmother, Emerentia, who I'm sure most people have never heard of. But as soon as you go from the medieval section to the Renaissance section, then it's dominated by men. Portraits of men with globes, with books, etc., etc. And the women are now then appear in a very different way. So these female figures dominated medieval art and literature, but they continued into Renaissance art and literature in Catholic countries, but also, as Poonam said, in Protestant countries. Shakespeare, especially in his last plays, evokes these figures in a way that is empowering to women and is almost visionary. Throughout the Middle East, for example, goddess figures were erased and were never recovered. But they continued to flourish in different forms in Europe and even America into modern times. For example, as the figure of liberty in the Statue of Liberty, as the figure of justice blindfolded in courtrooms, as Nike, as the muses that writers invoked over the centuries. And this constitutes one of the signal differences between Islamic cultures, which erase the divine female presence, and Christian cultures, which sort of try to erase them, semi-erase them, but then recuperate them. I think it's a great mistake to eliminate English literature and Shakespeare from English departments, as many in the US have done, although some are reconsidering now. A factor that influenced my deciding to retire early was that the English department at University of Montana started denouncing Shakespeare, many members, as an irrelevant, dead white man. And he had only 2 defenders in the whole department. One of those 2 said the defense was that the plays provide an opportunity to discuss imperialism, colonialism, etc. If that's the reason to read Shakespeare, I wouldn't bother to do so. Every writer in English, regardless of nationality, race, gender, and all other categories, is influenced consciously or unconsciously by Shakespeare because of the hundreds of idioms and phrases that Shakespeare coined that are now built into the language. Amusingly, my students sometimes remarked that the plays use too many cliches, like green-eyed monster and all that glitters is not gold. So they become cliches after Shakespeare coined them. But why have they become cliches? I suggest that it's because they are true. As we mature, we realize that all that glitters really isn't gold, whether in the case of jewelry or in the case of people. However, regardless of these shifts in academic opinion, viewers and readers of Shakespeare recognized from the start, and I talk about this in the introduction, that there was something extraordinary about his work. And they still do recognize this. Readers, I mean, not just in the academy, readers outside the academy. There was a conversation about my poems at a Delhi bookstore about a year ago, and the lady who was conversing with me said that present-day poets don't care about rhyme and rhythm, and they don't care about canonical writers like Wordsworth and Keats or Dickens or whatever. So I was a bit taken aback, and I didn't quite know how to answer. But later, Kashish Dua, who's here today, she pointed out that bookstores, the same bookstore we were sitting in, have shelves full of canonical English novelists and poets, and they wouldn't have them if no one was buying them and reading them. And I think this is very true. Readers, therefore, have followed the advice of Shakespeare's first editors. Read him, therefore, and again and again. So I'm very grateful to have been able to add this with the support of so many people, to have been able to add this tiny brick to the edifice of Shakespeare scholarship. And I look forward to discussions with all of you, both now and later. Please send me any comments on email. And again, thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Professor Vanita, for that very interesting brief discussion on the book. Thank you very much. And for sharing your experience and for sharing your love for Shakespeare, because of which we have a book like this. And I have had the privilege to work with you. Thank you so much. The floor is now open for question and answers. So if anyone has any questions, may I kindly request Dr. Dubey to please come and moderate the session for us.
Thank you, Amrapali. After hearing this discussion, which was really very interesting, a number of questions would be striking or some kind of observations. So I'll request audience to please share their questions if they have any. Yes, please.
Rakesh Bhattabyal, I teach history in JNU. I've been worried of the closing of the mines. And following Alan Bloom, I was thinking over the last year or so whether the attack on the classics or the greats has something to do with larger issues that we are also facing here. Now, everyone talked about being the very lonely monograph in the large study. So does this book, I'm asking anyone who will respond to this, this is not a question, it's like wondering aloud, whether this book adds to our effort to open up whatever small window we have in the increasingly closing minds in our own horizon.
Anyone from the audience? Yeah. Another question is from the.
Thank you, Amol. I am an independent scholar. So I have two small observations or questions. First of all, thank you for writing such a fascinating book. I had a look at it, and Shakespeare, to be frank, was a very boring character for me when I was in school. And unfortunately for our English teacher, he was a favorite. So she went on and on narrating about this thing. And it was only after Gulzar's Angur came that for first time I got attracted to Shakespeare, to be frank. Now, anyway, the questions that I have are two. One is to do with the 9 plays. Why 9? I mean, when you have talked about violence, I was just wondering whether we can place plays where we can place plays like Macbeth or Titus Andronicus, which are very violent plays, in this list of plays. Or can they be placed, or is it a over-reading of the thing? And secondly, because of the word history, revisions of history, I was just wondering whether, I have not gone through the entire book, whether you have discussed anywhere about the reinterpretations or misinterpretations of Shakespeare's play. And in this, I just want to cite one example, which is Merchant of Venice, which in the 30s, 33 to 38, especially under the Nazis, it had been staged around 86 times because of its anti-Semitic this thing. And instead of presenting Shylock as a very as a person with whom you have sympathy, they started showing him as a devil incarnate. And many of those plays, Hitler himself actually was an audience. And Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda, actually tried to twist around the narration, especially to do with Jessica's marriage, because of the Nuremberg laws and how they twisted the entire narration of this play. So I was just wondering whether that aspect has been dealt with in the work or not. Thank you.
But it's not just the Nazis. Throughout the performance history of Merchant of Venice, Shylock was usually shown as an out-and-out villain and with no extenuating features. That only began to change or be revised in the 20th century, or maybe late 19th. And that debate still goes on. Is he a villain or not? And anti-Semitism is flourishing even today. So I take the view, many scholars take different views. I take the view that it's a representation of anti-Semitism, but not an endorsement of it, and that it's a critique of it, and that Shylock himself gives extremely powerful critiques. Not just that famous speech, "Hath not a Jew eyes," etc. Yeah. Not that one, but that one too. But the much other wonderful speeches, for instance, the trial scene, when he's asked, "But why do you hate Antonio?" And he says, "I hate him for no reason. Why should I give a reason? I don't give a reason. Somebody hates cats for no reason. It's completely irrational. Somebody hates bagpipes. It's for no reason. It's irrational." Now we know that Shylock has very good reason to hate Antonio, so this is not true what he's saying. But what he's saying applies perfectly to Antonio's hatred of him, or to Christian generally hatred of Jews, because it's visceral, but really Christians had no reason to be afraid of Jews. They were such a tiny minority, and they were not at all threatening. So it was a visceral thing, just as you hate cats or cockroaches or bagpipes. You can't explain why. So that was the kind of, and so Shylock gives a perfect description of what we call a phobia, which is an irrational fear that is not based on any facts. Right, so that's, what was the other point?
About the plays.
Oh, why these 9 plays? Well, these are the 9 plays on which I felt I had something new to say, and of course one could apply the argument to other plays, but these are the plays where I had something new to say, I thought. So.
Okay, the first one is also there pending.
Yes.
From Professor Bhatbel.
If I might add a little bit to your observation, that I hope Shakespeare studies will see a kind of comeback or resurgence, if not in the academy, in the theatre. In theatre, you do find plays being performed in translation, etc., and they do create some kind of frisson. But Shakespeare criticism over the last, I think, 20, 25 years has been so, in some ways, so deracinated by literary theory and some agendas, etc., that people don't want to read Shakespeare very much now. I mean, I was involved once in a debate at Queen Mary University in London, where between students and faculty, where the title of the debate was that, the continuance of Shakespeare in the curriculum prevents a decolonization of the syllabus. And I must say that the faculty won very rather narrowly. Lots of students said, there's too much work, it's boring, very difficult, why do we have to read this? And of course, dead white man, etc. So we had to work quite hard to kind of pose. So, today also there is this expectation of study to give immediate returns, as it were, or ideas which can be either encashed in the marketplace in the terms of some kind of job or something like that. And literary studies like Shakespeare, which is the acme, suffer because of that attitude. I don't know.
Any more of questions? Thank you. Thank you, Amrapali. You can take over.
May I now request Dr. Prasun Chatterjee to please come forward and say the vote of thanks.
Before we end this evening's program, we would like to say that it has been wonderful to be a part of this event. On behalf of our organization, I would like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to our esteemed guests, our chairperson today, Professor Desai, and our panelists, Professor Sharmishta Panja and Professor Poonam Trivedi. We are grateful to Professor Ruth Vanita for giving us the opportunity to publish her book. Sincere thanks are also due to Mr. Shugat Jain, the director of Primus and Ratnasagar, Mr. B.N. Verma, founder of Primus Books, and the entire team of Primus here for their cooperation. Finally, I would like to thank all of you for being present here and for finding the time to be with us today. Thank you all.